Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. And Dennis, thank you very much for those very generous comments. I'm not sure anybody could ever take credit for all the things that you just said, but it sounded good, I guess, when you do that. Normally, there's an announcement about controlling your wireless devices and phones, but you know, with me here, the answer is keep doing them. We love it when you just keep texting and emailing and doing all your work and everything else. So I'm good with that. Dennis invited me to come to describe a little bit of the Verizon story. Most of you know us. If you live or work around here, you know our company fairly well in one way or another. But I thought that getting a little insight as to what our journey has been would give you a few ideas about how the journey you're undertaking here at Mount Sinai might have some similarities to it. I'm sure not everything is the same, but I think organizationally and culturally there are probably a lot of lessons that are worth thinking about. So just to start out with a little bit of our own self-interest, so Verizon every year spends about $3.5 billion on health care, taking care of our employees, their families, and our retirees. If you think about the actuarial lives of our people, we will have commitments to spend close to $25 billion over the life of all of our extended family employees, retirees, and their families. So we have a huge interest in understanding where the healthcare industry is going and how it can really help get more productivity and better science and more innovation throughout the course of all the things that we do in our own company. Mount Sinai and Verizon, of course, are both long-standing, traditional, iconic organizations. Both of us feel we have a public purpose without any doubt at all. But the interesting thing is that every 15 or 20 years, we have to reinvent ourselves. And I think the science takes care of that. You are world-class in how you approach the science, but I think as you heard from your leader, culture is every bit as important as creating the right environment as actual investments in the science. So let's move ahead and talk a little bit about our experience. So let me just get the mechanics down. Is there a latency in this, I guess? Who do I point this at? You? Okay. Okay. Oh, I got the wrong point. So I got this pointer is that one. Okay, I got it. Okay. Okay, very good. All right. So very quickly, Verizon was created in the year 2000, but the companies that formed Verizon have been around for 70, 80, even 100 years. On the right side of that chart, you can see the characteristics of our business. Maybe 20 years ago, 66% of our company was located in New York State. Today, it's less than 8%. So you can see we have changed. I think the more important point on this chart, you can read all the words on it, is the one about utility regulation. I think you suffer from the same issues that we did back then, and that is lots of federal and state regulation. People like to control your beds, your prices. Government like to control our prices. They like to control our services. Government loved to introduce new competitors into the field. At the same time, they were increasing our regulation. So don't feel bad. It goes on in every industry. And I think rather than become a victim of the Affordable Care Act, it is the best opportunity you will ever get to sort of change the paradigm associated with your institution. If we move to what drove this, I think you all know this, that in our world, regardless of what happened in public policy, technology is the underlying driver of change. You know all about Moore's Law and the Internet and PCs and Microsoft creating the operating support system and tablets and smartphones and all of that kind of thing, creating enormous change. But today we have new words in technology. We have object and voice recognition, machine vision, we have ultra-low power sources, we have supercomputing, big data, as Dennis talked about, advanced networks. In fact, if you go back to Star Trek, for those of you old enough to know Star Trek, the only thing left to be done in Star Trek is being able to beam you someplace. And I have a feeling there are people working on figuring out how to do that. Because if you can figure out how to move all this stuff at the speed of light, you can probably do that, I guess. So anything's possible. So Star Trek is almost done, and now we're on to the next generation. But this breathtaking change in technology has produced consumer control that almost everything we do in every industry moves to the consumer, and they almost control everything that happens in any industry that's going on today, whether it's computers, it's healthcare, it's education, it's finance. It goes on and on and on. And the big thing that's driving this, of course, is low-cost transactions, mobility, and consumer control. If you look at the way the outside world looked at us, these tend to be soft issues, as you might look at this. They're not hard science, but they're important. So whether or not that you can manage these kinds of issues puts you in a position to attract funding and philanthropy. It puts you in a position to find new sources of growth, and it puts you in a position to recruit good people and the best people in your fields. So it's important for a company to actually focus on these soft issues, like the institution you have. How you perform during Hurricane Sandy and so on is all very important to how the outside world perceives whether or not they want to invest in your brand, invest in your reputation, and help you grow in the areas that you would like to grow. So just a few facts now, just very quickly. Just take a look at the last 5 years. World internet population doubled to 2.3 billion. You can see that. There are estimates that by the year 2016, there will be over 20 billion devices connected to the internet in some fashion. So when you think of all the eligible people in the world by 2016, take out all the 2-year-olds, because 5-year-olds now have phones, but 2-year-olds don't. So I suspect when you look at that, everybody has multiple connections. Healthcare will be a big driver of that when you think about all the things you could do in the healthcare industry with respect to component devices to do that. Growth of IP traffic, internet protocol traffic. So you have all these devices, now that creates data traffic. We're looking at an 8-fold increase in just the last 5 years. Estimates are that the compound annual growth rate of IP traffic is 30% a year and will continue that way for at least another 4 or 5 years. If you look at the growth of wireless, something we're very interested in, you can see that penetration in the US is over 100%. So if you look at all the people eligible for a phone, the people have now more than one device. My guess is here in the audience, many of you might have 2 devices, whereas 2 or 3 years ago, you never would have even thought about that. So the demand, so here's the situation we face with this, if I can just put a ribbon around it. So in our industry, what we saw is demand skyrocketing. People have all these uses of the network and the internet. The business model was beginning to fracture. Free became in vogue. People love free stuff, so they thought the internet was free, broadband was free. Government kept creating more opportunities for access. Government kept creating more licenses for others to enter the field. So what we were sitting in is a situation in which the public loved what we did, but the investors and the institutions that were running this stuff, we were pulling our hair out trying to figure out how we were going to sustain a business model in which demand was through the roof, costs were going up, but profitability was going down, and we were trying to figure out how we were going to get out of this box that we were in. The answer is going to be innovation, because we had to change the game. We couldn't continue to do the same thing we always did. I think it's the same story I just heard Dennis talk about in a second. So we were faced with a dilemma. Now every company says this, every company believes that it's a builder rather than a seller, but I know in our industry, almost 90% of the companies in our industry sold themselves. Only 2 that I know of that didn't. Us and Southwestern Bell. Even the great AT&T sold itself. So what makes people do that? Well, the answer is they have big ideas, but they had small plans for execution. So they run out of money, they run out of resources, and then they run out of will. Don't lose your will as you go through this. So we face this choice. And of course, you know the famous scientist Yogi Berra, you know? When you see a fork in the road, you take it. So in this case, you don't want to sell, you don't want to lose control of your institution because you have a point of view. And that point of view is very important to establishing where you take the organization over time. At Verizon, we felt we had a point of view, and I'll come to that in a second. But we had some issues to fix, and you could see them on this page. We needed more customers, we needed more scale. We needed to be bigger so we can generate the internal resources to do the things we need. We had to invest in the right technologies. We'll come to that in a second. We had to reinvent the business that we were running. And we had to get very excited about making sure that the customer thought we were making them part of the revolution as well. So this wasn't just about us, it was about the customers that we serve. So we developed a strategy. Again, every consultant will give you this strategy. This is not very complicated. It's doing it that's the issue. So I'll go through this very quickly one by one, but in the case of mergers and acquisitions, it gave us scale. Investing for growth gave us a differentiation in who we were. Reinventing the core was all about process and standards. And transforming the customer experience wasn't what we said, it was what the outside world said about what they thought we were doing with our business. So very quickly here. If you look at our mergers and acquisitions, Verizon is made up of 100 companies. We bought $65, $75 billion worth of companies during the period 1995 to 2006. The most important lesson to be learned from that is we increased our scale, we broadened our addressable base of customers, and we acquired some capabilities we didn't have. So that's the top line look. What we did inside the company is we crushed all the different methods that people had for doing the same thing. We came up with standard operating environments, open architectures, quality of service measurements. We rationalized our supply chains, and we helped build our brand. So acquiring stuff and then letting it run as little tribal fiefdoms isn't a good idea. Acquiring stuff and creating a new identity for your company is very different. So Verizon today is very different than it was even 5 years ago. And every day we learn about how to create the scale and the materiality we need to invest in the things that are important to us, particularly in the areas of technology. So that's mergers and acquisitions. If you look at our investments in technology, this is probably an area that's very, very akin to what you're all interested in here. So in our case, what we thought was, we never believed that carrying a digital bit from point A to point B was a commodity. Other people like to say it was. Other people like to challenge us and to say, well, anybody can do that. And what we figured out is everyone couldn't do that. And so we said, we're going to do that as well as anybody ever did it before. Sounds simple, but it hadn't been done before because you couldn't walk down the street with a cell phone 20 years ago without getting dropped 5 or 6 times. Your copper network couldn't handle any sort of complex data requirement. So we invested in our network. And we went from 1G to 2G and wireless to 3G and now 4G. We invested in fiber optics and all sorts of digital switching and all the things that make our network. But the important thing here is we created a platform. Now, money-wise, what we did is we were spending about, in a company like ours, in our industry, I'll use our numbers. If, say, 20 years ago we were a $10 billion company, we would be investing $1.2, $1.5 billion in capital for every $10 billion, about 12%, 15%. We upped that over the course of all our mergers to where we were spending over 20% of our revenues in capital. So today, the last few years, we were in the 15 to 20% range, $100 billion company spending $15, $18 billion in capital. We've come down a bit. We're in the $13, $14 billion range because we've got a lot of investments behind us. But we made the fundamental decision to accelerate our investments. Now, the key is we just didn't do it and spend it on all the things we always did. I can tell you our engineering departments would give us requirements that they could have spent $20 billion doing what they always did. We had to sit down and really focus on resource allocation and making sure that we changed the way we spent our money. This is very hard. How did we do that? We didn't get it right all the time, but a couple of things we did though. We engaged our strategic partners. So we did a lot of work with our vendors and suppliers on collaborations and joint projects. We're really focused on standardizing our platforms. So for example, I just use one. If you look at 2G technology in wireless or 3G technology in wireless, they're non-standard. Every carrier had their own standard. When we started on a 4G investment, because we thought we were a market leader, we drove standardization around 4G. So now, within probably the next 18 months, almost every device to be connected to a wireless network that's 4G will be compatible. So these are the kind of things. When you look at, in science, what are those areas in which there are, I think, commonality of purpose and where you can help standardize? So standardization shouldn't be a threat, but Mount Sinai could lead that in certain areas where it makes some sense and then create actually a bigger market for the whole industry to focus on. So this is a really important point, to do that. You all know how much you spend, and every institution measures the way it spends its capital differently. But in our case, it's a big deal in terms of how it changed our company over time. We also spent a lot of time on reinventing the core. Now, this is all about process. This is about productivity. This is about freeing up non-productive costs and reusing that so that we can give a little bit to our shareholders and a little bit to our institution. In our case, believe it or not, we reinvested close to 2/3 of our savings back in our business, and we gave 1/3 to our shareholders. Our shareholders would complain a lot, you can give us more. And our answer to that was, well, if we can prove that by reinvesting we can increase our growth rate, you should be happy with that. The early years, we struggled. But for the last 5 or 6 years, we're a $100 billion company growing at +5%. That's a pretty good record for people to feel like, okay, we'll trust you to spend the shareholder money by reinvesting most of it in your core, provided you create the growth going forward. So growth is a big deal. The other thing about reinventing the core that's, I think, very akin to what I think you do here is, so we created a core network. And I described that just a second ago. But the other thing we really focused on was, what are the platforms that ride on top of that network in which we can offer services that we never, ever offered before? So in our case, for example, it was video. We never offered video before. We can offer access to the internet. That really wasn't our strength. We did things like storage capabilities through data centers. Talk about e-commerce, security, disaster recovery. These are things that you used to buy from IBM, or you might buy from Arthur Andersen or Booz Allen. Now you could buy them from us because they're an extension of our core business. So when you think about the science that you all are involved with, which platforms cut across everybody and which things are unique to a certain disease management or a certain area of science that you need. See, if you think yourself through that, you can actually create a lens that's much broader than just by looking at everything on a vertical basis. It's very, I think it's a great exercise to go through. It creates teamwork. It also creates an enormous amount of intellectual property that only you would own, not others wouldn't have. So if you look at this from the customer standpoint, the other single thing we had to do is we had to shift ourselves from being compliance-driven, regulatory-driven, to market-driven. This is not easy because it's a soft issue, but we spent a lot of time looking at external benchmarks and actual customer surveys. So even though our technical people would always comment on about, well, you can't look at the Fortune study, or you can't look at this study because this has this flaws or that flaws, it didn't matter because the public thought they were important. So we decided that we would measure ourselves exactly the way everybody else measured ourselves. Now, we would still do our own internals just to compare, but the bottom line is it became important for us to be perceived by the market as moving in a direction in which people felt we cared about the services that we offer to them. So we did things. We created a single brand. We integrated our process. We focused a lot on culture. And just to comment on this, employees in any institution, they love their individual areas of expertise. They love their immediate teammates. But employees also like to be part of something bigger than themselves. And it's a simple concept, but there's enormous pride in Mount Sinai when Mount Sinai does well. There's terrific pride in when your organization and department does well. But the issue is we kept reinforcing that being part of something bigger was very important, because people understand that when you're part of something bigger, there could be more resources available. There could be more upside. And so it's a real motivator to attracting people and attracting funding. And it just, I think it builds off itself as you go forward. So if we come to the end of the story, when you look at our company today, you get to the hard numbers, which some of you might be interested in. You look at the two pie charts, and you just look in the last 6 years, and you can see that, look at the percentages. Things that are not growing, that 52% of legacy and other on the top, which is mostly plain old telephone calls, by the way, or simple fax devices. You would see that used to be a bigger portion of our enterprise, and today it's 22%. And what you can see is the pie chart is bigger, the pie is bigger, but the mix of things we offer are different. And what's interesting, even today, we have to reinvent the pie on the bottom, because the 63% wireless still has a lot of voice in it, and that's moving to data. So the journey never ends, and so 6 years from now, there'll be a third pie on the bottom that will show even a further differentiation of where revenues are coming from. But I think what's really important is the way that Mount Sinai contributes to the healthcare industry will continue to evolve and change and give the broader institution a chance to win going forward. So to just wrap up here, if you look at the lessons for Mount Sinai, and I'm not presumptuous enough to think I know all the lessons for you, but I think there are a couple of things that coming from our industry that are maybe worth talking about. So investing for the future, however you define your investments in the science and your investments in technology, a couple of things. Open networks, open architecture, materiality, scalability. So it's very difficult. And I'm sure this is the case in any science organization. Having worked at Bell Labs, I get a sense of this, that in the old days, you could have 100 projects, and they all are important. But somebody has to sit down and think about which ones have the potential to scale and which ones have the potential for materiality. Very difficult discussions, but that only can be done with collaborative discussions across. I think there's all sorts of issues surrounding collaborations with investments in technology. One of the things we did is we set up innovation centers. It's interesting, one in California and one in Boston. So what we did is we created a laboratory and put all our technology into it, all our fiber, all our wireless, all our storage capabilities. Any capability that we thought made some sense, we put in there. And then we invited people to come in and either write apps, do projects, which in our words could be clinical trials and things of that nature. And we just allowed people to play with our technology to help create seed corn for others who had ideas about things that we didn't really understand. And what we found is people figured out a way to use our capabilities differently than we even had ever imagined. So innovation, you need a lot of collaboration. And actually the biggest firms, the market leaders, have to lead the way in collaboration because you have the most to gain and the least to lose. And years ago, it was the reverse. People thought you had the most to lose if you gave away your intellectual property. But today, with the breathtaking changes in technology, there's no doubt that, as Dennis said, anything's possible. So you have to believe that technology is bigger and the science is bigger than any one thing anybody could do in this room. So it's a great thing. The other thing we did is we really focused on our brand. Along the way, it's really important to build the Mount Sinai brand just like it was important for us. And it's really important for you to help the distribution side of the Mount Sinai complex, your hospital, to make sure that all the science that you're developing finds its way someplace into the distribution side so that the end user, the clients and the patients are treated in a way that they know that the value chain starts here and it works its way through and you deliver superior service to the community and to all your clients. So hopefully, Dennis, that give you a little bit about the Verizon story, and I would be delighted if there's time to maybe follow up on something that would be of interest. Sure.
So if anybody, we have some time for questions. So if you have any questions, please come up to the microphone. I'm going to start with a question, and that is, Eric Topol has written, I think, a very provocative book called The Creative Destruction of Medicine. I think it was a title to attract people to buy the book. It's not really talking about destruction of medicine, but it makes the point that we have not, as a field, medicine, really taken advantage of the digital revolution to improve patient care, to use smartphones, smart devices, to communicate with our patients in their home environment and so forth. So my question, Ivan, is where do you see that going in terms of companies taking on this challenge to create devices that improve our ability to communicate with our patient, to monitor them in more real time, to be quicker to intervene when a disease gets out of control using smart devices? Do you see big companies like Verizon getting into that? At this point, I think it's been mainly smaller biotech initiatives.
Yeah, okay. So I get the feeling I've been just given a layup to make, and I have to answer this question correctly. So look, this is a very interesting subject. So just a little bit of, one bit of background. So I serve on the board of New York Presbyterian. I work with Dennis as, Dennis is a board member on the New York Genome Center, which is a collaboration of 11 of the research and science organizations here. So I have a strong interest and not a lot of knowledge yet, but at least some view of this. So let's answer your question this way. One of the things I find interesting, if you go into any hospital, what you'll find is most of the doctors are walking around with all sorts of electronic devices and are connected into their networks and everything else. But you go to their office and all their records are paper. If you watch the nurses walking around hospitals, they are lacking in technology. So, and I don't think this is I think this is endemic. So I think what's will happen is it's what happened to us. It's what happened in the financial services industry, is that the digital technology will move so much of your intellectual property into software, which is very hard to protect, and it's very hard to manage, and it will become very low cost. So the issue is, it's not necessarily a threat, because it will produce, I think, greater productivity and higher quality of service to patients. But it is clearly a threat to an organization that doesn't move itself going forward. So I do envision two things occurring: that the application of the technology will eliminate almost all of the non-essential transactions that you do by labor or by analog. So your entire analog experiences will change. You'll move to a digital environment. And my guess, most of you already believe that. You probably already think you do it. My guess is you're not as digital as you think you are, but you will get more digital as time goes on. I think the other thing I would say is this, and this is just my opinion, not necessarily grounded in any facts, and that is healthcare is becoming more virtual. So you don't have to walk into a center to be treated for things. There will be technologies that allow this to occur almost any place. So the other thing that I think is pretty interesting is you're not constrained geographically. You can serve almost any place you choose to. I also think if you're into the science fiction, which to me it's science fiction, it's not to you, but I think can technology replace drugs in some cases? So I don't know. I think there's lots of issues. So I do think all these little entrepreneurial companies all over the place are trying to figure out what you're not doing and what they could do faster and better, and create more virtual treatments and virtual discoveries that would, in effect, cap the momentum that they see you having. So I think it's really important, and I'll use the term that we use in our industry, it's important for you to, and this is my concluding comment, it's important for you to do the things you know you want to do, but also don't be afraid to go over the top on yourself. Don't be afraid to cannibalize your existing operation with something new. We did it. You know, we were a copper network, and we built copper, and then eventually we built fiber, but then we had wireless. And we never constrained wireless against our landline phone company. We said, okay, fine, if wireless becomes more important than our landline business, which you could see it did, we would do that. So I think, Dennis, you're going to see that occur. And you know the science better than I do, whether it's genomics or all these other issues. Those things will change the fabric of not only Mount Sinai, but the whole industry.
Dean Charney, maybe I can ask a question. What did you hear that resonated with you from Mr. Seidenberg's comments that are relevant to Mount Sinai? So this is for Dean Charney.
Oh, he's asked you a question.
He's asking me what I learned.
Probably nothing.
A lot, because I feel what Ivan presented about Verizon is a roadmap for Mount Sinai. We need to anticipate the changes that haven't yet occurred, or just beginning to occur. You know, and we're making some of those investments, and it makes me feel that we need to accelerate some of those investments. We have some of our scientists working on new software programs to connect our work on the human genome to the electronic medical record. Erwin Bottinger's in the audience, and he's been doing that with Omri Gottesman. We have another group that is developing what may turn out to be a personal genome app. So that we developed the concept that all of you own your own genome, and that we will provide you information through that app about what your sequenced genome actually means for you and how you can change your life. So we want to be on the cutting edge of that. I wish that NIH heard this talk, because our R&D primarily comes from NIH, and NIH tends to be overly conservative. And not, I think, facilitate innovation. And we should all work to kind of educate the NIH to be thinking more out of the box, so that they can assist us, with these exciting new initiatives. And I can go on, but the last thing I'll say is one of the key messages that I heard is that silos inhibit innovation, that great findings come from unexpected directions. And I've worked hard at Mount Sinai, and will continue to do so, to not tolerate silos, to not tolerate that this is my area and nobody else can get involved in it. We need a transparent approach to science, so that together we achieve things that we think were not possible.
Over here?
Yep.
So that was a terrific talk, and I won't ask Scott what he thought about it. In thinking about the companies, that are successful innovation, of which Verizon's one, Apple, Google, they come to mind. You talked about developing a larger sense in a company that people feel that they're part of something larger. You gave a lot of detail on other things, but it seemed like, oh, can you hear me now? No. It seemed like, because now I'm getting an echo. It seemed like that must be a key point on why some companies manage to continue to innovate across a decade and others don't. Could you amplify the point about how you actually managed to create a larger sense that people were part of something larger in Verizon? How do you actually do this?
Okay, fair enough. I don't think there's one formula, but so let's look at the, as you would all agree, let's look at the symptoms. So when you have a long-standing traditional organization, it develops its own intellectual property. And some of it comes from the standard relationships of suppliers. So in our case, we got it from the equipment manufacturers and stuff. So there were two things missing from that. So when you took all of the new technology companies, particularly in Silicon Valley or up in the technology corridor in Boston, we didn't have enough collaboration going on there. So one of the things that we did is that as we expanded our company through mergers, we created some outreach and created specific projects to work with these firms. So Google's a really good example. So when Google first came along, every speech that they would make, they talked about free. Used to send us into orbit. Because, okay, it's good to give broader access, but everything can't be free. And they meant it, that everything would be advertiser supported and everything would be free. So we went to them and we said, okay, look, we agree prices should be lower, we should broaden it, but we need to find ways to satisfy each other. So rather than look at Google as a threat, we turned a corner and started to collaborate with them, and the result of that became Android. Because Google had no platform on mobile devices until Android, and Verizon helped supercharge their presence into the market. And while Apple has got a great platform, Google's got a bigger market share. So that's an example of where we said the market's bigger than the self-interest that we were, I think, limiting ourselves to. That's just one example. I think a couple other examples. The same thing happened with in fiber optic world. We believe that everybody needs, whether you need it or not, we thought everybody eventually would use 100 megabits to a fixed location and 20 megabits of capacity to a mobile device. And that's a lot of capacity. But every expert we talked to would suggest that if every phone interaction was video and every interaction you had would require downloading of large files, that the amount of bandwidth that existed on the planet would never be enough to cover everything you all want to do. And now we're finding that out if you just look at the requirements you have for, I think, genomic research. Nobody could even figure out how much bandwidth you need to do all of that. So that's another example where we sat down with storage companies and supercomputing companies and said, okay, let's figure out how to expand our capacity by orders of magnitude, not worrying about whether or not we were limiting our market share because the issue had to be going forward. So I think lots of teams, lots of outside in. I think one of the things that helps, I think you're good at that. I think the medical industry, I think sometimes you head fake it, but for the most part you're good at lots of collaborations. But I think when you have collaborations, you do create a flow of information in and out of the organization. The key, though, is not to let it get stuck in a silo. The key is to make sure you cut across the other organization. The other thing that I would say is we embraced open architecture, which sounds so simple, but large institutions just love to put ribbons around and I think lots of rules around their intellectual property. And it's a very difficult issue. I know you have this issue in great detail here, but you're going to have a hard time protecting your digital intellectual property over time. So the best thing to do is help expand it quickly and get a return on that intellectual property in a shorter time period. as opposed to thinking that you can control the ownership of that for long periods of time. So I think those are the sort of mindsets that you have to. I hope that helps a little bit. Also, by the way, bringing in a lot of new people and changing the complexion of the organization also helps. I mean, those things go hand in hand with that.
We have time for one more question.
I had a question about, so I'm assuming that a large part of your, the change in the pie chart from 2006 to 2011 involved a huge expansion in your wireless provision. And in order to do that, you have to successfully navigate a regulatory environment. And I think that's something that maybe scientists in the medical field needs to take that very much into consideration, strategies for navigating a regulatory environment as they innovate. Is there a blueprint for a game plan of how to successfully get politicians and the public on board in that sense?
So I know this is being webcast or taped, and I suspect the public will hear everything I say, so I will be careful. But I'm retired, so I could probably say what I want to say on that. Look, I was, just to frame this, one of the jobs of the CEO is to constantly, bang up against the regulatory process to seek the freedoms and reduce the amount of interference that goes on. But one of the things you learn over a long period of time is government will move to the exciting areas the same way you do. And they view that they want to protect the public in the same regard. So here's what I think our formula was. And it was really 2 or 3 simple steps. And the first was, we took the first risk, period. So we said we would invest X billions in building out our wireless network. We said we would buy radio spectrum because we thought data requirements were going to be 2 or 3 times what they turned out to be. We said we would put fiber optics into people's homes. And even though we took the hit with Wall Street and our shareholders, you lead government by taking the first risk. Now, the thing about government that's very interesting is if you're wrong, you're screwed. Okay? So they get rid of the CEO, they change the entire institution. But if you're right and you create growth, they're trumped every time, in my mind. They leave you alone. And when they don't leave you alone, this is where you hire a lot of lawyers to make sure that you challenge, but you challenge it after the fact. So I think it's important that the sequence I laid out is really what we did. We took the first risk. We thought we were doing something useful. And then when everybody tried to benefit from the things we did, we used the legal system to at least reasonably control the process. And today, if you look at that pie chart, we are far less regulated in the traditional way we were 20 years ago. Now, every company like us, we have regulations, so we're fine. We have all the things that every company has. But we don't have the invasive regulation that goes with controlling your prices and controlling the ability to introduce products and services. And I think it's because we took the first risk. Okay.